our new stuff, or new old stuff, or old new stuff, anything about any previous stuff that needs more stuff. Okay. So last time we're looking at the introduction to our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, or more particularly his theory of synthetic a priori knowledge. And we saw that one of the things that Kant was trying to do was explain, argue how this is possible. And his presentation of it involves kind of the following parts. First, in terms of how it gets to be a priori, the idea is that in order to even have the experience, you've got to have that particular feature. To give a concrete-ish example, he considers space and time to be examples of things that we have a priori. And sort of the idea is that in order to have a spatial experience, to use a terrible metaphor, you already have to have like the space filter in there. Or to have a temporal experience, you gotta have like the time filter in there. So to use a bad like Instagram metaphor, it's kind of like to take the picture, in order to apply the filter to it, the filter is already going to be in there. But of course, the filters we're using in this metaphor, we're not aware we're applying, we just apply them automatically. Now, one problem that we'll also see more of in the future that Kant runs into is he draws a distinction between the phenomena, what we experience, and the noumena. And the noumena is supposed to be the really real for real, or in the German, the Ding an sich, which I'm totally probably mispronouncing because, French. I also mispronounce French because it's American. And so he runs into this challenge of how do we actually know what's really out there? We'll see more of this in the future. So, because in a way, continuing the Instagram metaphor, because our experiences are put through these filters, we automatically, without even realizing, apply these filters, and they categorize our experiences into causation, time, and space. And so they're there before experience, and we don't get them from the experience. They're sort of, again, to use the metaphor of filter, the whatever it is comes in, and it gets filtered, and then that's what we experience. And they shape, filter that experience before we even realize it. And according to him, all of this a priori knowledge has got that, kind of the usual feature. It's supposed to be necessary, which means it couldn't be any different, at least for us, and in every possible world, it is true. And of course, the a posteriori, things that happen are known after experience, they could be otherwise, they could be different. And so one of, as we'll see more in the future, one of Kant's big contributions, or big damages, was this notion. Before we go into our next exciting slide though, anything about this stuff? It needs more stuff. Now, as might be imagined, after the time of Kant, other philosophers who came and then eventually died. I think all these guys are dead now. Pretty sure most of them are. I'm not responsible for that, but I'm pretty sure they're dead. They came along and had various critiques and criticisms of it, so to sort of move us up into the 20th, 21st century, we've got A.J. Ayer, and famous philosopher, but again, being famous in philosophy is like being famous for curling. No one really knows who you are. He gave a fairly conventionalist critique of this notion of synthetic a priori, and claimed that you could take all of the a priori knowledge and distill it down to analytic truths. So, believes that instead of having those, synthetic a priori, you just have the analytic truths. Then this fellow Ewing, or some pronunciation, he claimed that all knowledge of mathematical, logical, and other statements could all be construed as a priori. So people kept on working on this with varying degrees of success. Now, Ewing presented his transcendental argument, kind of modeling it on, and we'll see in the future with Kant. Kant also had a transcendental argument. And here's how it goes. A.J. Ayer made the claim there can be no synthetic a priori truths. Now, Ewing's kind of clever response to this, and it kind of mirrors, in some ways, the reply of Plato to the skeptics, which is, his claim was that if the skeptic is, if relativism is true, then the claim that it's not true is also true. So if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's false. So either way, it's false. And Ewing tries kind of an analogous maneuver, trying to show that if his claim is true, then it must actually be false. So Ayer claims there are no synthetic a priori truths. And Ewing says, well, this seems to be, ironically, paradoxically, a synthetic a priori statement. Because he's claiming something about the world, there can't be any of these truths, and he's claiming that we know this a priori. So to deny a priori, synthetic a priori truths, is to claim there is at least one, namely that there's none. But as Ewing points out, if the claim is true, then it's got to be false, because if it's true, there are none. It itself is a priori synthetic, so it's got to be false. So weird paradox. So if it's right, it's wrong. If it's wrong, it's wrong. So even if, then of course a person might cleverly say, okay, there's one, and the one thing is that there's no others. But Ewing claims, suppose we have doubt in other ways. We say those synthetic a priori examples are pretty sketchy. Are there any that seem to be non-sketchy? What he claims is this: the laws of logic seem to do this. So they would be a priori, but he claims also synthetic. One example of this would be the principle of non-contradiction. And the reason why it would seem to be one of these truths is the idea that to even be able to think, you've got to be able to have the principle of non-contradiction, and of course to even think of the principle itself requires the principle. And denying it, again, sort of a paradox thing, to deny non-contradiction would depend on the principle of non-contradiction. So if someone says non-contradiction is not, it's not true, denying it requires that principle itself. Thus creating a paradox. So, because if it's not true, it's denial, and if denial is denial, it just as valid as denial itself. So, what's the gist of his argument? Well, basically, it's pretty, in a way, either a clever or tricky argument, much like the replies that our good dead friend Plato gave to the sophist, which essentially is to deny synthetic a priori truths requires accepting a synthetic a priori truth, and so if the person is right, they're wrong. And of course, if they're wrong, they're wrong. So they can't possibly be right. Which is either brilliant or just a clever trick. So that was Ewing's contribution. Before moving on from Ewing, any more that needs more Ewing? So why doesn't everybody just embrace the analytic synthetic stuff? Well, as I mentioned before, alluded to before, there is this notion of containment. And one of the problems is, what does that even mean? Now, when you press people like, okay, what is this containment? They'll give the usual suspects as examples. For example, one I've used multiple times is the statement, all bachelors are unmarried. And the claim is that the idea of unmarried is already present or contained in somehow the notion of bachelor. And they usually add that nothing has been added to the concept of bachelor. So one way to kind of look at it is to say, well, to push aside the metaphor of containment and just go with definition, one way to look at it is to say, well, when you say all bachelors are married, the definition of bachelor is unmarried male. So, yeah, if you say a bachelor is unmarried male, and then you say they're unmarried, you're just saying the unmarried male is unmarried, which says nothing new. Now, what about this next one? If something is red, it is not green. And in this case, I don't mean like you could have, not denying you could have like things that have, you know, multiple colors, but if you have something that's red all over, like a joke, it's not also green all over. And we know that's true. So for example, if I say, I have a folder in my backpack that is red all over, is it also green? The answer would be, no, you don't have to look. You know, if it's red all over, it's not green. Unless I'm doing like that joke, you know, it's black and white red all over, newspaper. Or I guess today would be a web page. But according to the people who talk about this stuff, if we take the notion of concept of red and we analyze it, however that works, we don't find in there the notion of not being green. So if we define red, you know, a certain way with your light level, blah, et cetera, we don't find that supposedly. Again, one of the problems of this whole containment thing is kind of like, well, what if you just define red? What if you put that in your definition of red? Just say, hey, look, it's in there. I added that definition. But here's kind of the problem. We do get this, and we don't have to look. But we don't seem to get it by this analysis, supposedly, or so the claim goes. So the claim is, it's not analytic, because you don't get it by analysis. It's not empirical, because we don't have to look. So again, the claim is that it's got to be an example of a synthetic a priori, something we know about the world by, you know, before we actually have experience. And again, you know, to go back to the example, if someone says they've got a, you know, a ball in their backpack and it's, you know, it's all red, and you say, well, is it, you know, is it green? The obvious answer is, well, no, unless they're playing like a joke, like it's recycled or something. You know, it's all red, but it's also green because it's made of recycled plastic. It would be a terrible joke. I'm sure someone told it before, but probably terrible. So there do seem to be kind of reasons to have this. But again, kind of the problem we've seen all along is this notion of containment. We get what it is for water bottle to contain water, for memory on a computer to contain photos, but what is it for like an idea to contain a concept? And as you might imagine, some of the critics have taken that line. Now, when I was in grad school long ago, kind of one of the big names is this fellow Quine. And he died, and he was predicted by some that he would become, you know, kind of like Descartes and others and be famous forever, and others predicted he would fade away pretty quickly. But we're still talking about it, so he hasn't faded yet. Or maybe he has, and I'm just way behind the curve. Now, Quine got his claim to fame in a paper, a short paper, or rather long paper called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And often in modern philosophy, you become kind of like philosophically famous by getting a paper that everyone starts talking about. And in many ways, it's like getting famous in the art world or the music world or on YouTube. You do something, need not be particularly good, but then you get everyone talking about it. And of course, today, you know, people link to it. Back then, people would cite it and talk about it. And so he had this paper come out, and for whatever reason, it became kind of the thing people talked about. It was kind of the, you know, piano cat of its day. Now, he does argue correctly, I think, that containment is at best a vague metaphor. again, we kind of get what it's like to have a bottle containing water or pockets containing keys, but what is it for an idea to contain a concept? And using this, he contends that because containment is so vague, yet so critical to the notion, that this vagueness infests the whole distinction. So it does seem in a way to be an appealing argument, because again, when people make the argument about how you have this analytic synthetic distinction, they do claim that, okay, the analytic is you do an analysis. And at first we kind of get it. Okay, it's like you take triangle, by definition three-sided, good. You take bachelor, by definition unmarried man, got that. But then you kind of push like, what is it to contain something? So going with the, red is not green, and they say, well, red is not green doesn't contain that, so it's going to be synthetic a priori. But what does that mean? Like, what do we say that red contains? I mean, maybe you could say, well, red also contains in its definition not green, and not blue, and not purple. So it ends up, if you push it, you kind of realize those paradigm examples, triangle and bachelor, work fine, but when you start pushing it, you start to wonder, what does that containment mean? And so he says, since it's built on this vague metaphor, it really is not a very good foundation. So it'd be kind of like, I don't know, kind of like a scam, in which, someone says, we got this really good stuff, and they give you like 2 things, and all the rest is just, not just dirt. So the gist of his paper can be summed up in these 3 points. The third point being that given that containment is vague, and its vagueness affects everything in that distinction, because it's too vague to make it hold, so the analytic and the a priori is so unclear that you just can't maintain that distinction. I mean, the gist of it basically is, we're less heavily on containment. Containment is a vague metaphor, so you can't clearly maintain that distinction. To use an analogy, it'd be like if someone had a division between 2 species, and the distinction was just like this incredibly vague thing that didn't really hold. You have to say, well, they're not really you really can't maintain that distinction. Now, after Quine came along 2 other famous philosophers, and again, being famous philosophers like being famous at curling, this fellow Grice, super famous philosopher, and Strawson, also a super famous philosopher. They opposed Quine. They argued that there is a presumption in its favor, kind of like the presumption of innocence in the legal system, and if we reject that distinction, essentially do a reductio ad absurdum. That if we reject that distinction, we end up with these absurd consequences about, things like bachelors and triangles, and that's just terrible. And so what they argue is, essentially, we don't need to have, this clear account of containment to make it work. That, basically the gist of it is, to sort of round the argument, Quine essentially saying, this is a vague metaphor, it can't ground the distinction, so gotta toss it. And then Grice and Strawson say, well, if we do toss it, this leads to absurd results. So even though we can't draw the definitive line, to provide this clear formal definition, we still need it. So we'll just kind of wing it. So kind of the gist of their argument is, it's like, yeah, we really can't define it properly and exactly, but we can't do without it, so we got to keep it. So at this point, basically the battle is, it's too vague, get rid of it, to, yeah, it's vague, but we need it, we can't get rid of it, because if we do, then we get stupid results, so let's keep it. And they wrote papers back and forth, and then they all died. Not because of the papers, but because of other things. More recently, we have Chisholm and Kripke. I think they're both dead. I think I looked them up. They were around fairly recently, but I think they're not anymore. I still need someone to make that dead, not dead app. You just put in, I guess only Google's dead, not dead updates. Or maybe like they could have the Amazon Google Smart thing, just say to it, Alexa, is this guy dead? Alexa will be like, dead, or really dead. That'd be useful. I mean, maybe it could be the next, $1 million app. So, dead, not dead. So Chisholm and Kripke, super famous philosophers, which again amount to not being. They do have Wikipedia pages. If you look them up on Wikipedia, they will have pages. Now Chisholm essentially goes through these traditional theses and defends them. Synthetic a priori knowledge, it's okay. Then his fellow Saul Kripke, he ends up sort of splitting apart a priori knowledge and necessary truth, and claims that we can have a posteriori necessary truth, which is seemingly impossible because, as we saw, the classic distinction is a posteriori knowledge from experience is always contingent. But he makes the interesting claim that you could have knowledge based on experience of necessary truths, and that we could have a priori knowledge that we know somehow by pure reason that is not actually necessarily true. So you could have things you know through experience, necessarily true in all possible worlds, and things you know a priori that may not be always true. Now again, this kind of tears apart the classic distinction, and not everyone buys that breakdown. And then you get super famous philosophically and die. So the first one to look at in some detail in this battle of the synthetic, the analytic, the a priori, the a posteriori, is our good dead friend and sharp dresser Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, portrayed here right before he went on tour with, I think it was Kiss, or maybe it was Aerosmith, possibly Aerosmith. It's his Sammy Hagar look. So, big hair was a big thing then, just like in the 80s, 1880s, 1780s, 1680s. Now, Leibniz was German-ish, because when he was Leibnizing, Germany was not a unified country. One interesting historical fact is Germany used to be a bunch of ununified states. Then Otto von Bismarck, of the blood and iron, unified Germany, and then they started World War I, and then started World War II, then they got split up, and then they got back together. And I guess, who knows what they're going to do next? Probably get in the fight with Russia, because why not? Now, during the time period Leibniz was Leibnizing, German culture was fairly, stagnant. Like if you look at historically during this time period, 1600 through 1700s, not a lot of great German intellectual achievements during this time. Now, like much of Europe at this time, there was a split between sort of the common folk who spoke German. There's also the aristocrats who spoke French, and the educated who spoke Latin. If you have entered European history, or you like conspiracy theories about Europe, one thing that's known is that the European nobility are all kind of related. So like the German Kaiser is related to well, there's no Kaisers anymore because they got rid of those guys, but they're related to the English nobility, the French nobility, etc. And only England still has the queen, who has the corgis. The corgis aren't nobility, but they are corgis. And they're kind of cute because corgis. But anyway, so Leibniz was saying he was probably the most major intellectual thinker of this time. In his early years, he was a child protege, essentially doing all this amazing stuff early on. Ended up getting his doctorate at age 21, so pretty early. Now he was offered a chance to be a professor, but instead decided he wanted to be a diplomat. And he wanted to diplomat two things. Thing one was he wanted to create a unified Europe, because Europeans, if you look at European history, it's mostly a history of fighting Europeans, going to the Middle East, fighting the Middle East, coming back, fighting each other, going to the Middle East, and then just kind of repeating it as necessary, and fighting the Americans. lots of money. And Leibniz thought it'd be better if they had a unified Europe. So how did that work out? It kind of did, but then now it's kind of not because of Brexit, and then Russia's doing its thing. So World War III coming up soon. Somewhere, possibly Europe, possibly North Korea, possibly New Jersey. Always a possibility. New Jersey, yep. Well, some World War III could start there. It is New Jersey after all. Now, the other thing he was concerned about was the church. Leibniz was very, very religious, and during the time period Leibniz was Leibnizing, of course, it was after the Protestant Reformation, so you had the Catholic Church, you had the Protestant, divisions, you had the Church of England, and of course you had the Eastern Orthodox Church, and Leibniz wanted to reunify the church, to reestablish the one church. How did that work out? Well, on one hand, not, because there's no, the church, but when was the last time there was a war between Christian faiths, where people were killing each other because they were Methodist or Episcopalian? A long time ago, probably the 30 Years' War. So, I mean, there have been nations that, are nominally Christian, killing each other, like the Germans and the French and the English, but they weren't religious wars. So one big plus is it's been a long time since we've had a religious war within Christianity. So plus. So I guess that worked out. Okay. Now, he spent his professional career in doing diplomacy. But during the time he was diplomating, he was also doing a lot of work in philosophy and mathematics. But since his day job was diplomacy, what he did in philosophy was mostly done in pamphlets, short essays, and sometimes collected into books, including his work on monadology, his metaphysics, a work, The Odyssey, on the problem of evil. And so he really was a diplomat who happened to do philosophy, although he's best known, of course, for his philosophy. Also known for his work in mathematics, and some years ago, they found some of his old papers stashed away somewhere, and he had proven centuries ago these mathematical theorems, etc., that were only recently proven by other mathematicians. And it kind of raised an interesting question of how many solutions and things, solutions to various problems are lurking in some attic somewhere and just people just haven't found. He also developed a calculating machine, an early computer, and if you look at the history of computer science, he's in there for a couple of reasons. One, developing that machine, but also for developing the notion of essentially binary logic and binary mathematics. So he did a lot of stuff. And then, of course, has died. So what was he trying to do? Well, he was Leibnizing around the time of John Locke, Descartes, Hobbes, etc. And during that time period, they all kind of had this similar kind of goals. It's kind of like the time when boy bands dominated the world. They had similar goals. And these were the philosophy, not boy bands, but people doing similar things. So much like Descartes, what he wanted to do is do math. And he believed you could take math and theology, study of religion, and he wanted to build this notion of universal harmony. Much like Descartes, he wanted to reconcile science and religion, because he was super religious, but also super sciencey. And this, of course, is a problem we still have continuing to this day, because we have, in the United States now, still debates about whether schools should be teaching evolution or creationism or both. And there's actually a museum of creationism, which you can, I think it's like in a big Noah's Ark that one can visit. I believe funded in part with taxpayer money. So definitely go see it because you probably helped pay for it. Now another split we've seen before was between mechanism and teleology. Mechanism is the view that everything works in a deterministic way, essentially a clockwork mechanical universe without purpose. Teleology is a view that everything happens for a reason. There's a purposeful universe. And this debate is ongoing. I mean, again, part of it is kind of the debate between creation and, non-creation. But it's also sort of a more general debate between, is the universe just a uncaring, blind, purposeless machine that just, an unbuilt machine that just goes with no meaning behind it, or is there a purpose to life? And so we end up with that fundamental dichotomy between stuff happens and stuff happens for a reason. And the debate still goes on to this day. And he also wanted, of course, to reconcile the philosophy of the ancients with philosophy of his time. Now, much like Descartes and Locke and Hobbes, he looked at the existing situation and said, science and philosophy have accumulated a lot of stuff. But, he claims, there's no order to it, there's no inventory. It's kind of like going to, I guess, like an antique shop that just kind of, everything's just sort of there, with like, everything is piled where it happens to be. Or if you've ever seen the show American Pickers, and they go to like some bar and just like piles of bicycles and tractors and signs and just everything's all over the place. I guess that kind of scenario. So that's what he wants to do. So how does he do it? Now, not surprisingly, being math guy, he's going to do math stuff. So he believed, like Descartes, that if you use logic and math, that is the path to the truth. Now, the notion he has is one that still impacts and affects science today. Interestingly, even people who are atheists in science believe kind of a version of this. And here's his idea. He didn't originate this idea, but he developed the idea that the universe is a harmonious system, which is a view that's been held for quite some time, but kind of an interesting twist on this, and one that has become an integral part of the sciencey stuff, is the idea that the universe was written by God using math, that God is the ultimate mathematician. I guess nerd God. And so that is that there is, God has this mathematical language, and the universe is basically coded. And as you might imagine today, with computer science being, computers and algorithms and stuff being dominant, this idea is very appealing, that the universe essentially is mathematical. Now, even people like Stephen Hawking, who didn't seem to really believe in God, they had the view of God as the mathematician. Now, sort of the previous view of God, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, etc., have always said God is the creator, but this is kind of a change in the model of creation. Kind of the older version was God is like craftsperson or artisan, that he constructs the world, like a craftsperson, like someone making pottery, or someone building, constructing a house. And this one is much more of a computer science model, that God is not, working with his hands, so to speak, and, throwing pots or, cutting wood and building planets, that God is coding the universe. And again, this is a huge impact today. You have thinkers in physics, even when they're atheists, they still tend to believe that the universe is written in a mathematical language. Not by God, but it's just somehow, it's math. Math is a real thing. And then, of course, with computer science, it's all mathematics. So this was hugely influential, and still influential today. Now, one of Leibniz's most critical contributions, upon which our entire information age depends, is this. Leibniz figured out, probably the first, but then again we've lost so much work over the centuries, maybe someone sorted this out long ago, but as far as I know, he was the first person to realize this. You can take complex mathematical concepts and reduce them to simpler and simpler concepts. Now, the most simple of all would, of course, be zeros and ones. And if you ever wondered where the whole 0 and 1 thing come from, and if you look at most electronic devices, computers, laptops, etc., their power button is often a sort of abstract or symbolic version of a circle with a 1 in it. And the reason why is because essentially 1 is on or true, and 0 is off or false. So you ever wondered like why, you know, the power buttons, don't always do this, but many devices do have that. It's because of that, 1 on, 0 off. And Leibniz figured out that you could take all numbers and express them as zeros and ones. You know, what kind of crudely put, we would call like machine code. And if you've ever seen, they do this often in like sci-fi shows, and they're showing like someone hacking, they'll show like a whole bunch of zeros and ones. And the reason why is, well, it's just showing off, but there's probably no connection there. But the idea is that, of course, this is binary mathematics. Everything is just zeros and ones. Now, in the truth tables, of course, it's true and false. So why was that important? Well, from a purely practical standpoint, if you have a laptop, tablet, smartphone, it runs on binary logic. I mean, someone else probably would have invented this eventually, but in terms of who gets the credit, it was Leibniz. No Leibniz, we probably would have had it eventually, but probably much later. So literally your phone, your laptop is running philosophy. Basically proof of concept of his ideas. Now, given his incredible success in mathematics, which we witness today, I mean, Facebook, the interwebs, etc., that's all that stuff manifest. Leibniz believed he could extend it to everything, all areas of knowledge, including physics, metaphysics, law, and even ethics. So, in a way, it made sense, because if the universe is mathematical, and he had this incredible success with binary mathematics and binary logic, why not extend it to everything? Now, he was incredibly optimistic. He believed this would be super useful. How so? Well, this is his claim. One thing would be this. One problem we run into, in fact, we have a story, a parable about it, which is, of course, the story of the Tower of Babel. And the story of the Tower of Babel is what? You ever familiar with Babel or Babel? Well, the idea was that the humans got together and decided in their arrogance to build a tower to reach God. And so what God did, instead of just blowing people up, he just made it so people couldn't speak the same language, so people couldn't work together. And it's the story that endeavors to explain why people don't speak the same language. Now, ever since humans have had different languages, one problem we run into, of course, is trying to have a language that everyone can speak, the communication problem. I mean, it's something, a little silly example of this is something you see on like sci-fi shows, like Star Trek and Doctor Who, etc. When people go to like alien planets, run into aliens, one question they kind of answer is like, well, how can you be talking English to these aliens who've never met humans before? And of course, the way they work around it in Star Trek and Doctor Who is like universal translators, etc. Because it'd be really boring to watch, people spending years trying to work out a common language. It would be, Star Trek be talking. Now, and what we've tried to do in our own civilizations is solve that problem. Now, one solution is learn lots of languages. But then, of course, that's a problem because it takes a long time, and we don't really start doing this in most school systems until it's kind of too late. You start in like high school, and it's like you're not going to learn to speak French in 2 years in high school. You kind of got to start early. So we need something that people can talk to universally. Now, one thing that does kind of work is math, because if you don't speak English, you can do like math stuff with people. If you wrote this on a board, pretty much anywhere in the world, people would they have different words for 2 and 2 and 4, but they can do the math. However, of course, that's still pretty limiting because you could do 2 plus 2 is 4, but that's not going to tell you like where the bathroom is, for example. So his dream was if you could develop these languages, that what you do is you would do a similar thing, create a universal language for physics, mathematics, ethics, etc. And every scientist and philosopher would understand that language. Now, and it's not far-fetched again because we all understand math. If you go anywhere in the world, pretty much you could write out 2 plus 2 is 4, and even the person didn't speak any English, they would get that. They would know what you were doing. So in a way, we do kind of have a universal human language of math. But his dream is that we'd have a language for everything. Now his other dream, which is even more of a dreamy dream, is this. His view is that you originally have God, not drawn to actual size, and God has like the master equations of the universe. And then using his mathematics and code, he codes the universe. And so you get, it's like boom, he hits like run, and the universe runs, and there's light. And so all the code is still in there. And to use an analogy like a video game with virtual reality, God's a programmer, and the world is this virtual world created by, in this case, God. Now, if you had access to the source code of the universe, all the rules and language, he claims what you can do is this. If you had all the list of rules, you could take those rules and then go and try to make combinations, basically, to use a computer metaphor, if you have the programming language, you could try to write programs and try to run them. And if they don't compile, you know there's something wrong with them. But if they do compile and run, you know they get it right. And so, if he was right, what you could do is once you discovered the code of the universe, is you could just sit down at your, in his case with pencil and paper, today in a computer, and you could discover all these new truths just by knowing the rules, knowing the mathematics. And so you could do, in a sense, you could do physics, ethics, law, metaphysics, in a way, a priori, because you just know the rules and you just work through them, and you know all of the answers. Now, one advantage of this is every controversy could be resolved objectively. So, for example, suppose, take the debate about, well, we could take something like, to give a concrete example, in terms of like how this is actually kind of plausible, think of this. We've had hurricanes here in Florida, lots. And of course, we have weather predictions about hurricanes. And essentially what those are doing is applying Leibniz's idea. Because what we try to do when we model the weather is we're trying to figure out what is the mathematics of weather. And so the models have computer, all these algorithms, all these models of the weather. And then what they do is they put in the data, like what's happening, temperature, etc. And the idea is they create a program. And they run it, and it gives the possible track of the hurricane. Now, people of course complain like, oh, well, it's not 100% accurate, might as well not listen to it. But if you look at the way it used to be, which is 0 accuracy, hurricane, you don't know it's coming, it just rolls in and kills people. With today, I mean, yeah, it does, it does have that margin of error, but it is pretty impressive that we can model something so complicated. So a good example of what Leibniz had in mind would be those weather models. And if you had a perfect weather model, you would know exactly the weather every day. So you know, for example, and this would be incredibly useful, you know, for example, that a tornado would occur in Alabama, in Tallahassee, at exactly 8:12 p.m., originating here, striking here. People just put it in their planning and just say, okay, we're gonna, in 10 years, there's gonna be a tornado right here, so let's not build a house here. Or we can live here for 10 years and then pack up and leave, move that house down the road, then a tornado shows up and you're fine. And just imagine how incredibly useful and powerful it would be to know the weather every single day forever. There would be no more surprises. Hurricane, Cat 5, hitting here, 2022, exactly then. Okay, we know about it 10 years in, we know years in advance. And so you want to plan, your picnic, your vacation, 5 years in advance. You know it's going to rain in, say, Paris, France on this day. You don't want it to rain, you change your trip. All flight cancellations and stuff would be known. Because it would make life a little bit less, it's interesting because you know everything's going to happen, but you know all the stuff. So his dream was you could just have a perfect model and you'd know all the stuff. Now, in addition to weather, this is of course what Facebook, Amazon, and Google's are trying to do. Yeah, the Googles. Because Facebook wants to basically predict all our behavior to sell us crap. And so, to run ads. And so, and similarly with we have an upcoming election, they're trying to model electoral behavior to know how the elections are going to turn out. And so, even though this is, philosophy stuff, it's become a very concrete multi-billion-dollar business in creating models. And Leibniz, in a way, came up with the idea. You create, the universe is mathematical, you get the right algorithms, and you rule the world. And things like weather prediction, Facebook, etc., they're the manifestation of this for good and bad. Now, Leibniz made a couple of critical assumptions, which turned out to be problematic. The first one was this: that you could take everything, all human thought, and everything in the universe, and it could be reduced down like mathematics. And again, his kind of motivation, his inspiration, was how well math worked. He gets math down to zeros and ones, gets all that stuff working, he's like, wow, this is great. And then he thought, hey, this can apply to everything. So he believed you could take law and take the units of law, like contract, promise, etc. And then you reduce it down to the simple things, get the rules, and the same with ethics. You could have good and evil, etc. And reduce all that down. Now the problem we're into is this. It turns out that, well, I guess I can put it as a question. Do we have perfect models of all human behavior and know exactly what everyone's going to do all the time? No, probably for good, because people do terrible stuff. So one possibility is, people have argued, is that it can't be reduced. That, people may throw in we've got free will, that ultimately we're unpredictable, that we can't be trapped by the equations, which is often a theme of optimistic movies. So one possibility is this just can't be done. No matter how well you get the equations, we will not be trapped by the equations. That you'd always have unpredictable results. Now, a second possibility is it's just really hard, and we just need more time. Now, Facebook and Microsoft and the Googles and the Chinese equivalents like Alibaba, etc., they're gambling on that this is doable. Because again, the whole premise behind Facebook is constructing algorithms to analyze all the stuff to get there, so they can have marketing data to sell to other people, and so the Russians can influence our elections, and people can make money. And so Facebook and other companies are gambling that this is doable to a high degree. And in a way, we're running a real-time experiment to see how far this can go. Now, a second assumption, which has been proven to be totally wrong, is this. He believed this was going to be doable in about 5 years, that we'd have all the answers. Actually, the answer, actually really good. There is, of course, a book that has all the answers in it. If you get a PhD in philosophy, you get to see the book, and you know where it is. But you're also obligated to protect the book. So you tell everybody there's such a book, but it sounds like such BS, no one will believe you. And so you protect the book by telling everybody there is such a book, but it's so absurd, no one believes that. So the book remains perfectly protected by telling everybody there is the book. Yeah, because no one believes there's a book. And I told you there's a book, but you're like, no, there can't be such a book. And so it remains protected. Now, we kind of had an introduction to Leibniz's innate ideas in the form of Locke saying there's no such thing. And I mentioned that Leibniz said there is such a thing, so we'll see why is there, according to Leibniz, such a thing. Well, this is his claim. And it's about these innate ideas. As you recall, one of the big battles in epistemology is about what the mind is at day zero. So, again, we get those two basic camps. We have the empiricists, who say, on day zero, the mind is a blank slate. And again, going back to my computer metaphor, it's like the old, Commodore 64, Apple, really old Apple computers, where you turn it on, you just get a blinking cursor. So there's nothing, well, it's not even hard drive, there's nothing in it. You gotta make it do anything, you gotta put it in stuff. Then, for the rationalists, they believe in innate ideas, namely that stocked in the mind, before birth, so there are these ideas. And again, the metaphor there is like with a modern computer or a smartphone or tablet, where you already have, when you turn it on, you don't just get a cursor, hopefully. You get like a screen with all these apps and stuff on it. It's already pre-stocked with stuff. So, already stuff in there. So the biggest debate is tabula rasa versus stuff. Now, if you're on the tabula rasa side, in a way that's kind of it, because there's just nothing in there to begin with. If you're on the stuff side, innate idea side, then there's all kinds of different possibilities about what's in there, how it's in there, how it works, and so all kinds of options. Now, Leibniz's view is this. Now, he was aware of kind of an obvious problem, the ones Locke brought up, namely, if you take the view that innate ideas are just in there and everybody's got them and everybody knows them, then that's probably not true. Because, as Locke pointed out, if you travel around the world and talk to people in different cultures, they're not going to have these allegedly innate ideas. And so, and if you talk, like children, for example, are not going to have knowledges of, not going to talk about the Pythagorean theorem or logical truths, etc. So that seems right. Innate ideas, whatever they are, they're probably not things that everyone's got just loaded in there, or anybody can spout off Pythagorean theorem and logical laws and so forth. So Leibniz, aware of that problem, kind of dials back on the innate ideas a bit. And this is what he claims. He claims not that you've got all these, sort of metaphorically speaking, all these apps installed, ready to go. His claim is a much more modest claim. He says, the mind simply must have a structure that allows it to discover these universal and necessary truths. And the reason you enter like, why is there a rock there? Here's why. He claims, by using an argument by analogy, that the mind is like a block of, not a box of chocolates, but like a block of rocks. I guess some people are more blocks of rocks than not that's more. Now, interestingly, I checked this because I was curious myself. Marble does have veins, not like gross veins like you're tapping and it starts bleeding all over the place. That'd be horrifying. It's like, oh god. But it's like it's kind of like with how wood has a grain. If you ever like whittle, that's what. It's like right before the interweb, so I spent a lot of time whittling. That was our internet. You get a stick, and you get a knife, and you whittle. And it was an app called Knife and Stick Whittling. It's every bit as exciting as it sounded. Although occasionally someone would cut themselves, then you'd get a trip to the hospital, and that would be the exciting. Good times. Now, with whittling, of course, if you've ever done it, sometimes there's like denser parts of the wood. It's harder to push the knife through. That's when people do the push and end up stabbing their friend. trip to the hospital with stitches. Super exciting. Good times. Now, marble apparently works the same way. That you normally kind of think of it as just being like, rock. They just kind of whack it with the sculptors hit the chisel with a hammer. But apparently, one reason why statues to be a certain way is the marble has veins, softer, and denser parts, and so you kind of have to work with that. So the structure of the marble actually determines ahead of time what kind of shape you can make it into. So it kind of limits what can be done. So in his metaphor, he says the shape of the statue, and some sculptors that like this metaphor, that the statue is already in the marble. The job of the sculptor is simply to free the sculpture from the marble, to take away the rock until the statue is revealed. And Leibniz really likes that metaphor. So he says, just as if you have a block of marble and the statue is already in there, you just have to chip away the surrounding rock. He says, by analogy, experience is like the chisel, the sculptor, working at the mind. So what happens is, going with the metaphor, is, yeah, you have all these ideas in there, in the mind, but you're not aware of them right away. Just like if you look at this block, you don't see the statue, it's got to be revealed. And so the idea is that experience chips away at the block, and then they're already in there, they're just revealed by experience. So when you're, to use a concrete illustration, when you're learning math, you're not, well, the way the empiricists would say is that you get nothing in there, you take a math class, they write something on the board, and then it's in here. There you go. You get the stuff in there. Now what Leibniz would say is that when you're taking a math class, it's like chipping away, revealing what's already in there. So yeah, it's the context of being in. If you never took a math class, you probably would never come up with math. If you never experienced any stuff, you'd never come up with the idea of this mathematical stuff. But once you start experiencing certain things like trying to count things or seeing shapes, it starts chipping away at the marble, and those innate ideas are revealed. So it goes. Now, one of the obvious problems of this is that if you have to go through like all this experience for it to be revealed, then how do you know it's like always been in there? Because you looked at kind of from the outside, if you had hypothetically like imagine you had like two different beings. One really is tabula rasa, and one's got the ideas in there, but they're like in the block of marble. The way you teach them math or logic would be like the same way. And so kind of from the outside, you wouldn't notice any difference because you'd have to, be talking to this person, teach them all about mathematics, and then this person, the same thing, except in this case, you'd be putting stuff into their empty mind. In this case, you'd be, metaphorically speaking, chipping away the stone, revealing what's already in there. So in this case, you're putting it in there. In this case, it's there, and you're, releasing it. And again, from the outside, it would look exactly the same. So a very good question to be is, how could you tell which is the real thing? Now, kind of the view Locke attacks, there would be a clear distinction, because in Locke's view, it's like already all in there. He rejects that, but the view is attacking it's already all in there. So someone can just be sitting there, kind of a silly version. You can imagine like a 5-year-old sitting there saying, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Like, Billy, where'd that come from? I just found it in my mind. It'd just be in there, just be, you'd have, in Locke, this is Locke's criticism. If it worked like that, if it was just all in there, you'd expect like 2- and 3-year-olds to be spouting off theorems and axioms and, doing all this logic stuff, and they don't seem to do that. But then Leibniz says, well, no, you're not going to do it that way. You've got to go in and kind of chip away the stuff. But it's a fair question to say, is it being revealed, or is it just being put in there? Kind of like the thing where Socrates made his argument. He's asking all the questions of Meno's servant, and says, oh, he already had it in there. But a critic could say, yeah, after you told him all this stuff, after you put it in there. So that's kind of the battle. So why think then that the empiricist would be wrong? Because again, the battle is, okay, if you got to do all this work to break free those innate ideas, how do you know that you're breaking free these innate ideas that are buried in there, or just putting them in there? And here's what he argues. So the empiricists say, if people had innate ideas, this is Locke's argument, we would always be aware of them. We just do, as Hume said, do a test. We just close our eyes and, okay, do I have all the logic stuff in there? And in a way, that'd be super handy, because when you're taking a logic class, all the answers are already in your head. You just sit there and just close your eyes and yes. And same with math. Math and logic would be super easy. We'd all get A's. But do we? We did not. I did not. Logic, yes. Math, not so much. Now, Leibniz, of course, has to reply to that. And what he says is this. In his quote, we must not imagine that these eternal laws of reason can be read in the soul as in an open book. It is enough that they can be discovered in us by force of attention, which occasions are furnished by the senses. So, again, his reply is, they're not like sitting there, like obviously. You've got to go basically and really work to get them. Again, the metaphor with the statue. So, because of this, what are these ideas going to be? Well, they can't be, again, they can't be like fully developed ideas. So you wouldn't have, because again, the question would be, why can't you sit down a 5-year-old and say, Billy or Sally, what are the laws of logic? What is the principle of non-contradiction? Because if they're built in, we should all be able to do that, but we can't. So Leibniz says, oh, we've got them, but they're not fully developed, knowledge, but they're inclinations, dispositions, habits, etc. Now again, kind of the problem is, how would you tell whether they're really in there, and you just have to like chip them out with experience, or whether you're actually putting them in there? Now, both Locke and Descartes believed that the mind was effectively transparent to itself. Because Locke believed, you look around there and everything was accessible. And Descartes essentially regarded the same kind of thing. He did consider he may have powers that he's not aware of, but he believed that he had access to all the contents of his mind. Leibniz, of course, has to counter that. And he says, you can experience things without actually being conscious of it. And given his love of analogies, no surprise that he makes another one. He gives the example of a waterfall. Today, since most of us don't live near waterfalls these days, but many of us do live near traffic, if you ever live like by a road or in a city, what happens in terms of the noise? It's loud. But what happens eventually if you live there long enough? You get used to it. And then if you really notice it if you live in a city if you come from a small place that's really quiet, and then you go to like a big place, and you're like, wow, this is super loud. Then you live there long enough, and you go back to like your quiet hometown, you're like, yeah, it's too quiet, super quiet. Yeah, and so gradually stuff kind of, especially if you live in a place like Chicago or New Jersey, you just filter out all of that stuff. So Leibniz is right. I mean, we can, because if you live in a big city, you can sort of like, if someone says, oh, what's that sound, you can kind of focus on, oh yeah, that's machine guns. So every Tuesday, they have machine gun Tuesday here in New Jersey. Or, so you can focus on it, but when you're in the normal course of the day, you're just filtering that stuff out. So it does seem to be right. So Leibniz's view of the mind is more complicated. And he comes up with this notion that instead of being, oh, for Locke's view, and mostly for Descartes, in a way the mind is kind of like I guess a way to look at it is think of it like a theater where you're standing on, the center of the stage, and you can see everything. So everything is visible. And you can think of all of the ideas as like props on the stage, so you can clearly see everything. For Leibniz, there's various levels. So it's kind of like the active mind is like the stage, but then beneath it is, well, it's kind of like when you have complex theaters, like if you ever been in a play, or seen like, pictures or drawings of older theaters, they'll often have like a very complicated understage with all, where they keep all the props and they have the trapdoors and so forth to do all the effects. And so metaphorically speaking, for Locke and Descartes, in a way, it's just a stage, kind of like an amphitheater, where there's just not, what you see is what you get. And for Leibniz, there's all kinds of levels beneath, all kinds of stuff can be going on. So your conscious mind would be there, seeing all the stuff that's in the consciousness, but then down below there'd be all kinds of other stuff. So here we have not just a battle over kind of innate ideas, but also a dispute over the nature of the mind. Is the mind like utterly transparent? So it's like standing in the middle of an amphitheater where you can see everything, all the things that are there. Or is the mind like being in a big building, where there's all these rooms and levels and probably a spooky basement and a scary attic with all this other stuff you may not be aware of. Now, modern science probably supports what? Like, if you ever had psychology classes, which model seems more accurate to them? Yeah, probably the complicated one, because we talk about the subconscious, repressed memories, and so on, that there's stuff. And of course, one obvious thing is we forget stuff, and then occasionally memories will, like, going to the example, like you go home after several years, memories will just pop back in. Like you weren't thinking about them, but now they're back. Or like a song or something will pop in your head. You're like, oh yeah, I haven't heard that song in years. And when you talk about people's like, subconscious problems and issues, all kinds of stuff going on in there. Now, this idea that there could be things in people's minds that they're unaware of did lead to some serious problems. A while back, there was a notion in psychology of repressed memories. And what people were doing, perhaps in some cases intentionally with malicious intent, in some cases just kind of accidentally, is they would ask children if they had memories of being abused. And then they would ask all these kind of leading questions, and children would say they've been terribly abused. But then in some cases it turned out they were, but in many cases it turned out they were not. There was no actual evidence for this. And it wasn't so much the children were making it up, but they were being kind of led to believe this. And the theory is that people would have all these terrible memories that they did not actively have, and they were repressed and had to be released. And it turns out that not all of that was true. Okay, so Leibniz offers us a complicated view of the mind. And so, in his view, the innate ideas would be like down in the basement, probably. And to use the basement metaphor, it's kind of like, think of like spooky basement. So it'd be kind of down there dark, there'd be like sheets over things, and all be dusty, and you kind of peek in down the basement and catch a glimpse of like some shadowy shape with the sheet over it covered in dust, and you're not exactly sure what you're seeing. So, his view is, again, that those innate ideas will be buried down there. So you'd actually have to go looking for them, clean them up, dust them off, bring down a flashlight, etc. Or silver things. But once again, kind of the challenge is, are they in there and you just have to put a lot of work into getting them, or is it something that you have to get from the outside?
So he doesn't like deny that you have to use experience anyways to get the idea.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to go with metaphor, it's kind of like you have to go down the basement to see what's down there, and that would be, and the experience would be what gets you down into the basement. But as we all know, never go, never go in the basement. And kind of the challenge is, yeah, if you're putting all that, work, is it that you're, metaphorically speaking, walking down to the basement where it already is, or are you like building? I mean, to use a sports metaphor, think about like a view of natural talent versus like trained talent. So if someone, if you have two athletes and they both get the same coaching and they're both really good, and one person says, oh, this person has a lot of natural talent because the coaching just sort of revealed it, and the other coach says, well, this person had no talent and my coaching made them everything they are, both stories could be plausible, because is the case that the coach merely brought out the greatness of this person, the greatness is already in them, or is it the person, they could take anybody and transform them into somebody great? That's kind of a similar debate. Are the ideas like just built in and you bring them out, or do you have to be putting them in there? And we make it a matter of, going back to the coaching analogy, if people had to be coached for years and years to be great, then we might think, well, then a lot of it is, how much of it is built in and how much is put, is training and diet and stuff. So a similar kind of problem. So Leibniz believes in innate ideas, believes the mind is complicated, and so there's all kinds of stuff in there, or so he claims. And it's a question we're still working through. Again, current psychology probably goes more with the complicated view as opposed to the simple view, but there are still psychologists today who hold on to this, no doubt. Now, Leibniz also laid out, so getting back to kind of our main thing about these, the divisions between truths, Leibniz lays out two flavors of truth. Now, he's not claiming that they're alternative facts, so he's not embracing this sort of, relativism. He's claiming that, not that this can be true and also not true, or you have your facts, I have my alternative facts. Truth is truth, but he thinks we get different truths different ways. There are truths of reason and truths of fact. Again, going back, it's the standard distinction. He has his own variety of it. So the first type of truth is the truth of reason. They are, and he accepts, it actually kind of establishes the standard line, which is these truths are necessary, which means they're true, and they're always true and can't be not true. So their opposite would be impossible. And again, the usual examples would be triangles having three sides. The opposite, the not having three sides would be possible. 2 plus 2 being 4, the opposite, 2 plus 2 not being 4, would be possible. So the usual suspects. The other type of truth are truths of fact. Again, he's not claiming there's like fact, truth and alternative truths. There's just something's true means it's true, but he thinks there's two like buckets of truth. The truths of fact, for him, are contingent, which means that if they are true, they're true, but they don't have to be. And they could become false. So their opposite is possible. So, for example, that the backpack is on the table, contingent truth. And it's easy, of course, to show this because you just take the backpack and lift it up. And now it's false, and now it's true. So it goes true, false, true, false. So these would be like things about the world. And his view is these could be different. And speaking of different, time is up. So, it doesn't have to be, but it is. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you on the Thursday in the future.